I never thought I'd wake up to the sound of splashing water in my own backyard, Sarah muttered to herself, a bewildered frown creasing her forehead, especially since I hadn't invited a single soul over. At first, a wave of familiar comfort washed over her. It must be my family, she thought, a small smile playing on her lips. Maybe the kids decided to sneak in an early morning dip. But as she crept closer to the window, a prickle of unease danced down her spine. Something felt profoundly wrong. The voices she overheard were jarringly unfamiliar, a cacophony of youthful shouts that didn't belong to her children. There were far too many of them, and worse, a shrill, grating laughter pierced the morning air, laughter that resonated with no one she knew. A knot of dread tightened in Sarah's stomach as she cautiously pulled back the curtains, her breath catching in her throat. What she saw sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated fury coursing through her veins. A gaggle of kids, their ages ranging from perhaps 7 to 12, were joyfully cannonballing into her pristine, sparkling pool, kicking up a tidal wave of water that threatened to swamp her patio furniture. They were utterly, blissfully oblivious to the fact that they were brazenly trespassing. And standing there, right at the edge of the pool, barking orders with the authoritative tone of a seasoned drill sergeant, was Karen. Karen. The name alone tasted like ash in Sarah's mouth. Karen, her neighbor from hell, the same woman who had dedicated the past few months to making Sarah's life a living nightmare with her petty, nitpicking complaints and condescending, sugar-coated remarks. But this was a new level of audacity, a breathtaking display of entitlement that left Sarah speechless for a fleeting moment. Karen was dressed in a ridiculously expensive-looking swimsuit, designer sunglasses perched precariously on top of her perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a bright yellow whistle dangling from a lanyard around her neck. She wasn't just using Sarah's pool. She was running some kind of impromptu, private swimming lesson in it. The sight made Sarah's blood boil, a searing, incandescent rage that threatened to consume her. She stormed outside, her bare feet pounding heavily against the cool concrete of the patio. If Karen noticed the approaching storm cloud that was Sarah, she gave absolutely no indication. She continued to shout instructions at the oblivious children, clapping her hands with an infuriatingly cheerful demeanor, completely at ease in a space she had absolutely no right to occupy. It was as if she genuinely, truly believed that Sarah's backyard belonged to her, a shared playground for her personal amusement. A few of the kids, finally catching a glimpse of the homeowner bearing down on them, hesitated, their splashing momentarily ceasing. But Karen, with a dismissive wave of her hand, barked, "Keep practicing. Don't mind her." "Excuse me." Sarah's voice, sharp and laced with a barely controlled fury, cut through the air. "What the hell is going on here?" Karen turned, a slow, deliberate movement, as if Sarah were the one intruding on some sacred ritual. She languidly lifted her sunglasses, her eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe with an air of bored disdain, and then sighed dramatically, a theatrical performance meant to convey utter exasperation. "Oh," she drawled, as if just realizing Sarah's existence, "it's you." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air before adding with a saccharine smile, "What does it look like?" "I'm holding my swim class." Sarah stared at her, dumbfounded, waiting for the penny to drop, for Karen to realize the sheer insanity of her statement. But Karen just beamed, a sickeningly sweet expression that suggested she was doing Sarah some monumental favor. "In my pool?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with each syllable, the incredulity palpable. Karen scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. "It's practically a neighborhood pool." Sarah blinked, her mind reeling. "No, it's not. It's mine. On my property." Karen rolled her eyes, completely unfazed by Sarah's mounting fury. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's just a pool. It's not like you use it all the time. And besides," she added, gesturing towards the horde of splashing children, "these kids need a safe place to learn how to swim." Sarah's gaze swept across her backyard, finally registering the full extent of the invasion. There were at least a dozen kids in her pool, and scattered across her meticulously arranged patio furniture were a handful of parents, lounging comfortably as if they were at a resort. My lounge chairs, Sarah thought, her patience finally snapping. Get out! All of you! She roared, her voice cracking with raw emotion. A few of the parents shifted uncomfortably, their eyes widening at Sarah's outburst. But Karen just sighed again, shaking her head with exaggerated disappointment, as if Sarah were an unruly child throwing a tantrum. You're being incredibly selfish, she said, folding her arms across her chest, her expression radiating self-righteous indignation. I spoke with the HOA, and they agree that shared resources should be used for the benefit of the community. Sarah's jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. This is not a shared resource. This is private property. Karen smiled, but there was something smug, something undeniably triumphant, in the curve of her lips. Well, she said, with a flourish, I have permission. She reached into her oversized beach bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, handing it to Sarah with a knowing look. Sarah snatched the document, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She skimmed through the official-looking letter, her eyes narrowing with each line. It was an HOA document, all right, but as she read further, she realized with a surge of relief that it was completely, utterly unrelated to the current situation. It mentioned something vague about designated community spaces but had absolutely nothing to do with her private pool. This doesn't mean anything, Sarah exclaimed, tossing the paper back at Karen, the flimsy sheet fluttering to the ground. Karen clicked her tongue, a sound of feigned annoyance. I knew you'd be difficult about this. She turned to the parents, gesturing towards Sarah with an air of martyrdom. See? This is exactly why we need to make sure everyone understands the rules. Some people just don't know how to share. One of the parents, a young man with a sheepish expression, gave Sarah an apologetic look and quickly grabbed his child, hurrying off her property as if escaping a disaster. But the rest of them, emboldened by Karen's audacity, simply sat there, watching the unfolding drama with a morbid curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. All right then, she said, her voice dangerously calm, if you're not leaving, I'm calling the police. For the first time, a flicker of something other than smugness crossed Karen's face. It was a brief, almost imperceptible falter, but Sarah caught it. Then, just as quickly, Karen's trademark smirk returned, as if she had an ace up her sleeve. Go ahead, she said, her voice dripping with false confidence. I have connections with the HOA board. They'll just tell the cops it's a misunderstanding, and you'll end up looking like the bad guy for refusing to let kids swim. Sarah hesitated, a wave of reluctant understanding washing over her. As much as she hated to admit it, Karen had a point. She had witnessed firsthand how the HOA operated, corrupt, biased, and always, inexplicably, siding with Karen. If she called the cops, there was a very real chance they would dismiss it as a civil matter and tell her to take it up with the HOA, a bureaucratic black hole where her complaints would undoubtedly disappear. She needed a different approach, a way to fight back that wouldn't play into Karen's manipulative game. Instead of dialing the police, Sarah activated the camera on her phone. All right, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, since you have nothing to hide, I'm just going to record this. You know, for documentation purposes. Karen's smirk wavered, a hint of unease finally creeping into her eyes. Oh, don't be ridiculous, she said, waving her hand dismissively, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Sarah kept the camera rolling, her gaze fixed on Karen. So, just to clarify, you're admitting that you're using my pool without my permission, that you invited all these people onto my private property without my consent? Karen hesitated, her eyes darting around, taking in the scene. She noticed that a few of the parents, who had been perfectly comfortable a moment ago, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern. They had been fine with a simple neighborhood dispute, but the moment things started being recorded, the potential ramifications seemed to dawn on them. One of the kids, A small girl shivering despite the warm morning air, piped up, "Miss Karen, it's kind of cold." Karen forced a bright, overly cheerful smile. "All right, class dismissed for today," she announced quickly, waving her hand towards the edge of the pool. "We'll continue tomorrow." Sarah took a step forward, blocking Karen's path. "No, you won't." Karen turned to her, the smugness creeping back into her eyes. "Oh, I absolutely will," she said, her voice laced with a defiant edge, "unless you want to deal with some hefty HOA fines for denying access to a community resource." Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, watching as Karen strutted off with the remaining kids, her expensive swimsuit swaying with each self-assured step. The parents gathered their belongings, some offering mumbled apologies as they hurried off Sarah's property. But Karen, she didn't even bother to look back. As she reached the sidewalk, she tossed one last, venomous remark over her shoulder, "See you tomorrow." Sarah stood there, seething, her pulse hammering in her ears like a frantic drumbeat. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, Sarah sat in her living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls, going over her options. The usual methods wouldn't work. She couldn't rely on the police, and the HOA was clearly in Karen's pocket. She needed to do something drastic, something that would send a message so loud and clear that even Karen's thick skull couldn't ignore it. Something that would make it crystal clear that Sarah's pool was not a public park. And then it hit her. A slow, wicked grin spread across her face as the audacious idea took shape. If Karen wanted to use her pool so badly, Sarah was going to make sure she got exactly what she asked for. Just not in the way she expected. Tomorrow, Sarah was going to fill that pool with so much ice it would make the Arctic look like a summer resort. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a steely resolve hardening her gaze. She had spent half the night brainstorming ways to shut down Karen's outrageous behavior, but deep down, she knew that simply telling her to leave was about as effective as shouting at a hurricane. Karen had the HOA in her clutches, and if Sarah wanted to win this battle, she had to hit Karen where it truly hurt. But before she could unleash her icy plan, Sarah needed to understand the depth of this corruption. If Karen was brazen enough to waltz into her backyard and run a swim school out of her pool, it meant she wielded real power, and Sarah had to figure out exactly who was backing her. Her first target was the HOA. Sarah had always maintained a polite distance from their affairs, assuming they were just a bunch of overly involved neighbors who enjoyed making pointless rules. But now, she realized that ignoring them had been a critical mistake. If she wanted to take down Karen, she had to play the game on Karen's level, to understand the twisted rules of the suburban power struggle. So, that morning, Sarah walked into the HOA office, a small, nondescript building tucked away near the community entrance, expecting to have a reasonable discussion. Instead, she was met with smug smiles and condescending stares that made her skin crawl. The HOA president, a balding man with thick glasses perched on his nose and a permanent frown etched onto his face, barely looked up from his cluttered desk when Sarah entered. "Ah, you must be here about the pool situation," he said, shuffling some papers as if he already knew the script and was simply waiting for Sarah to play her assigned role. Sarah folded her arms, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Yeah, I want to know why one of my neighbors thinks she has the right to use my private property for her personal swim lessons." Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, let out a long, theatrical sigh, as if Sarah were personally inconveniencing him with her audacity. "Well, according to the community guidelines, all shared amenities should be accessible for neighborhood use." Sarah narrowed her eyes, her patience wearing thin. "My pool is not a shared amenity." He gave her a patronizing smile, the kind one reserves for explaining basic concepts to a particularly dense child. "That's where we disagree." Sarah clenched her jaw, fighting to keep her temper from erupting. "No, that's where facts disagree with you. My pool is inside my property line. It's not part of any community space." Mr. Thompson simply shrugged, his expression unchanging. "The way we see it, a pool of that size benefits the neighborhood, and it would be unfair to deny others the chance to use it. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So, let me get this straight," she said slowly, enunciating each word with deliberate precision. "I paid for my pool. I maintain my pool. I pay the water and electricity bills for my pool. But you're telling me that because it's big enough to be useful, it's no longer mine?" He nodded, completely unfazed by the absurdity of the statement. "That's exactly right." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to quell the growing inferno of rage inside her. "And what about Karen? She's not just using my pool. She's profiting from it. She's running a business in my backyard." Mr. Thompson waved a dismissive hand, as if Karen's blatant trespassing and profiteering were mere trifles. "Karen is providing a valuable service to the community. Parents trust her to teach their kids to swim. It's a win-win situation." Sarah stared at him, the realization dawning on her that arguing was utterly pointless. They weren't going to change their minds because they had already decided she was the problem. This wasn't about fairness or community. It was about control. Karen had somehow convinced them that she had more rights to Sarah's pool than Sarah herself did, and as long as they were backing her, Karen wasn't going to stop. Leaning forward, Sarah lowered her voice, her tone now laced with a cold, hard edge. "You know this is illegal, right? You can't just claim someone's private property as a shared resource." Mr. Thompson simply smirked, a knowing, unpleasant expression that sent a shiver of unease down Sarah's spine. "Then take it up with the board." That's when it clicked. They weren't just ignoring the rules. They were making new ones, bending the existing ones, all to benefit themselves and, more specifically, Karen. Karen wasn't just some entitled neighbor. She had connections, influence, and the full support of the HOA. Sarah needed proof, concrete evidence of this corruption. She spent the next few days meticulously digging into the HOA's past decisions, poring over meeting minutes and community correspondence. At first glance, it seemed like standard community management stuff, rules about lawn maintenance, pet restrictions, parking regulations. But the deeper Sarah delved, the more she realized just how many of these seemingly innocuous rules seemed to disproportionately benefit a select group of people, and that group was almost exclusively centered around Karen. Karen had managed to get ridiculous fines waived, complaints against her dismissed with flimsy excuses, and even had the HOA cover expenses for extensive landscaping work in her yard under the guise of neighborhood beautification. But the real bombshell, the smoking gun that made everything sickeningly clear, was a document Sarah unearthed detailing Karen's request from the previous year for a pool to be built in her own backyard. The HOA had vehemently denied the request, citing vague community aesthetic standards as their reasoning. That was when everything clicked into place with a sickening thud. Karen wanted a pool but couldn't get one herself, so she had simply decided to take Sarah's instead. And the HOA, for reasons Sarah could only speculate about, perhaps money, perhaps favors, perhaps sheer intimidation, had not only allowed her to do it but were actively enabling her. They had absolutely no intention of stopping her. Sarah knew then that she couldn't rely on reason or polite requests. She had to fight fire with fire. Her first move was to transform her backyard into a fortress of surveillance. She installed high-definition security cameras all around her property, strategically placed to capture every single angle of the pool. If Karen wanted to keep trespassing, Sarah was going to document every single second of it, creating an irrefutable record of her brazen entitlement. Next, she posted large, clear signs at every entrance to her backyard, emblazoned with the words "private property" and "no trespassing" in bold, red letters that were impossible to miss. To further solidify her position, Sarah had her lawyer draft a formal cease and desist letter, a legal document demanding that Karen immediately cease and desist from using her pool and trespassing on her property. Sarah personally delivered the letter to Karen's front door, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and grim satisfaction. Karen opened the door, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized Sarah. She snatched the letter, skimmed through it with a dismissive air, and then let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes with dramatic flair. You're really making a big deal out of absolutely nothing." Sarah stepped closer, her voice low and firm. "This is a legal warning, Karen. Next time you or any of your little students set foot in my pool, I will press charges. I will not hesitate." Karen simply smirked, her confidence seemingly unshaken. "Go ahead," she taunted, her voice dripping with arrogance. "I have friends on the HOA board, remember? They'll handle it." That was the last straw. The final, infuriation confirmation that Karen believed herself to be untouchable. Sarah realized that as long as Karen thought she was above the law, she would never stop her outrageous behavior. So, Sarah decided to make sure Karen felt the full weight of the consequences. The very next morning, Sarah checked her security footage, her jaw tightening with anger. Sure enough, Karen, with a blatant disregard for Sarah's property and the legal warning, had torn down the no trespassing signs and resumed her illegal swim lessons as if nothing had happened. That was all the ammunition Sarah needed. She meticulously compiled the security footage, including the part where Karen brazenly ripped down the signs in the moment she accepted the cease and desist letter, and sent it all to her lawyer. She also sent copies of the damning video evidence to local news outlets, posted it on social media platforms, and even reached out to a few legal groups that specialized in HOA corruption cases. Then, Sarah took things one step further. She started speaking to her neighbors, especially those who had been unfairly fined or targeted by the HOA's ridiculous policies. As it turned out, Sarah wasn't the only one who had been on the receiving end of their arbitrary and often punitive rules. People were angry, frustrated, and feeling powerless. But once they saw the undeniable proof of Karen's blatant disregard for the law and the HOA's complicity, a spark of defiance ignited within them. They were ready to fight back. Karen, in her arrogance and unwavering belief in her own entitlement, didn't realize it yet, but her days of unchecked power and petty tyranny were numbered. That evening, as Sarah sat on her back porch, a cool drink in her hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple over her now empty pool, she felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time: control. She knew Karen wasn't going to back down without a fight, but that was fine. Because now, Sarah had a plan, a deliciously wicked plan, and when she was done, Karen wouldn't just be banned from her pool. She'd be the one drowning in the consequences of her own actions. Sarah woke up early the next morning, a renewed sense of purpose surging through her veins. The previous night, she had meticulously gone over every possible way to finally rid herself of Karen and her ludicrous pool scheme. But every avenue led to the same conclusion: Karen wouldn't stop unless she was forced to. And with the full weight of the HOA backing her, normal methods were about as effective as trying to stop a charging bull with a feathered duster. Sarah needed something more, something dramatic, something that would make Karen deeply regret ever stepping foot on her property. That was when the idea, the truly inspired, gloriously petty idea, solidified in her mind. If Karen wanted to use her pool so badly, Sarah was going to make sure she got exactly what she asked for. Just not in the way she, or anyone else, expected. Sarah grabbed her phone, her fingers flying across the keypad as she made a series of calls. It took some persistent effort, a few persuasive explanations, and perhaps a touch of desperation in her voice, but eventually, she found exactly what she needed. A local ice distributor, intrigued by her bizarre but urgent request, had the capability to deliver massive quantities of ice blocks on short notice. After Sarah explained her ridiculous, yet utterly satisfying plan, they agreed to bring several truckloads to her house later that evening. It wasn't cheap, not by a long shot, but at this point, Sarah didn't care about the cost. The sheer satisfaction of witnessing Karen's reaction would be worth every single penny. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard, Sarah was outside, overseeing the delivery. The workers, burly men accustomed to hauling frozen goods, looked at her with a mixture of bewilderment and amusement as they maneuvered the enormous ice blocks into her backyard. But they did as she asked, their muscles straining as they dumped the massive chunks of ice directly into the sparkling blue water of her pool. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The water began to chill instantly, a visible fog rising from the surface as the temperature plummeted. Within minutes, the entire surface of the pool was covered in a thick, jagged layer of floating ice chunks, transforming the once inviting blue water into something that looked like it belonged in the Arctic. It was perfect. Absolutely, gloriously perfect. Sarah checked her security cameras one last time, making sure they were recording every angle. Everything was set. Now, all she had to do was wait. The next morning, Sarah didn't have to wait long. Right on schedule, with the punctuality of a Swiss train, Karen arrived with her usual entourage of students and their oblivious parents. She waltzed into Sarah's backyard as if she owned the place, completely disregarding the massive private property and no trespassing signs that Sarah had painstakingly put up again. The parents, still seemingly under Karen's spell, began setting up their lounge chairs, completely at ease on Sarah's patio. The kids, their voices shrill with anticipation, started running towards the pool, their excitement palpable. Karen blew her whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that grated on Sarah's nerves, signaling the start of her illegal swim class. Then it happened. The first kid, a boy with bright blue swim trunks, jumped into the pool, expecting the usual warm water. The second, his small body hit the icy water, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the morning air, so loud and unexpected that it echoed through the entire neighborhood. He flailed wildly, scrambling out of the pool as fast as his little legs could carry him, his face contorted in shock and pain from the sudden, frigid temperature. Karen barely had time to react to the first scream before the next child, a girl with pigtails, jumped in and had the exact same reaction, her joyful squeal turning into a shriek of icy surprise. Panic began to ripple through the group of parents, their comfortable chatter replaced by confused and worried murmurs as they rushed forward, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then, Karen, looking increasingly irritated by the unexpected disruption to her perfectly planned lesson, stepped up to the edge of the pool and cautiously dipped her toes into the water. The second her skin made contact with the freezing temperature, she yelped, a high-pitched sound of genuine shock, and jumped back, nearly slipping on the wet concrete in the process. Her face, moments before radiating smug confidence, now twisted in a comical mixture of confusion and dawning rage as she turned her gaze towards Sarah's house. Sarah stood on her porch, arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips, watching the delightful chaos unfold in her backyard. Karen stomped towards her, her wet footprints marking the pavement with angry splatters. "What the hell did you do to the pool?" she demanded, her voice shaking, not just from anger, but from the sheer, bone-chilling cold. Sarah gave her most innocent smile, the picture of feigned ignorance. "Oh, nothing much, Karen. Just a little routine maintenance. Decided to try out a new cooling system." Karen gritted her teeth, her cheeks flushed a furious red, not from embarrassment, but from the biting cold that was now seeping into her expensive swimsuit. "This is sabotage. You did this on purpose." Sarah simply shrugged, her smile widening. "It's my pool, Karen. I can do whatever I want with it." The parents around them, now fully realizing what had happened, were beginning to whisper amongst themselves, their initial confusion morphing into a growing sense of unease. Some of them weren't just annoyed at the freezing water. They were starting to question the entire premise of Karen's community pool. One of them, a mother with a towel wrapped tightly around her shivering daughter, turned to Karen, her voice laced with suspicion. "Wait a second, you told us this was a community pool." Karen's face paled slightly, her eyes flicking nervously between Sarah and the increasingly agitated group of parents. "It is," she insisted, her voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. The HOA, another father, his face now visibly angry, cut her off. "The HOA, this guy just froze his own pool. This doesn't look like something a community pool owner would do. Have you been lying to us?" Karen's eyes darted frantically between Sarah and the increasingly skeptical group of parents, her usual smug confidence starting to crack under the pressure. She tried to regain control, her voice taking on a forced cheerfulness. "Look, This is obviously just some childish prank. Don't listen to him. We'll be back next week when this nonsense is over." Sarah chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. "Oh, don't worry, Karen. The ice isn't going anywhere. In fact, I was thinking of making this a permanent thing. Ice baths are all the rage these days, you know." One of the parents scoffed, grabbing his children's things. "Yeah, I'm not bringing my kid back here. This is ridiculous." Others nodded in agreement, collecting their towels and muttering angrily to each other as they started to leave Sarah's property. Karen, now watching her so-called students and their parents desert her one by one, looked like she was about to explode. She turned back to Sarah, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You're going to regret this." Sarah tilted her head, her expression cool and unconcerned. "Am I? Because it seems to me that your little business just lost all its customers." Karen clenched her fists, her entire body trembling from a potent cocktail of cold and fury. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off Sarah's property, her bright yellow whistle still hanging uselessly around her neck. Sarah let out a long, satisfying breath, watching as the last of the disgruntled parents and shivering children disappeared down the street. It was over. The ice plan had worked even better than she had dared to hope. Not only had she completely and spectacularly shut down Karen's ridiculous swim school, but she had also, unintentionally, exposed Karen's lies to the very people she had been shamelessly scamming. That evening, as Sarah sat by the now eerily still, ice-filled pool, she checked her security footage. The entire glorious spectacle had been captured in perfect detail: Karen's entitled entrance, the kids' shocked screams, the parents' dawning realization that they had been duped, and Karen's utterly defeated retreat. Sarah knew exactly what she was going to do with it. The next morning, Sarah uploaded the edited security footage online, adding a witty and sarcastic commentary that perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. Within hours, the video started gaining traction, quickly going viral. People online loved watching an entitled HOA tyrant like Karen get exactly what she deserved. Comments poured in, with users praising Sarah's ingenious and hilarious method of dealing with the situation. Some even suggested new, equally mischievous ideas for how to keep Karen away permanently, ranging from installing a 10-foot-high fence to filling the pool with bright pink dye to ruin any future swim classes. It wasn't long before the video reached the wider neighborhood. By the afternoon, people were talking, and Sarah started receiving messages from neighbors she barely knew, some laughing hysterically at Karen's frozen meltdown, others thanking her profusely for finally exposing how Karen and the HOA had been manipulating the community for their own benefit. It seemed like Sarah wasn't the only one who had been on the receiving end of their ridiculous and often unfair policies. But the best part of all was the HOA's reaction. They couldn't ignore this. With the damning video circulating online and the neighborhood buzzing with discontent, they had no choice but to respond. That night, Sarah received an official email from the HOA president. It was a terse, formal notice stating that Karen was no longer authorized to conduct any community-related activities involving Sarah's pool. While she was still technically a resident, she no longer held any position of influence within the HOA, and any further complaints from her would be treated as personal disputes rather than community matters. Sarah laughed out loud, a genuine, unrestrained laugh of pure triumph. It was a pathetic attempt by the HOA to save face, but it was also undeniable confirmation that they knew they had lost this round. As for Karen, she didn't show her face for the next few days. The neighborhood was blessedly quiet, the only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah's backyard was a sanctuary of peace. The pool sat undisturbed, a glittering expanse of icy blue under the warm sun. No uninvited children splashing around, no shrill whistles cutting through the tranquility, no entitled voice barking demands. It was exactly how things should have been from the start. But Sarah knew Karen well enough to know that she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She was likely plotting something, some new, insidious way to retaliate. Sarah could feel it in her gut, a familiar knot of tension tightening in her stomach. She knew this wasn't truly over. Not yet. Karen was conspicuously absent for the next few days, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah's backyard was a haven of peace. The pool sat undisturbed, a shimmering expanse of icy blue under the warm spring sunshine. No uninvited children splashing around, no shrill whistles slicing through the tranquility, no entitled voice barking orders. It was exactly how things should have been from the very beginning. But Sarah knew Karen far too well to believe that she had simply given up. Beneath the surface of the quiet neighborhood, Sarah sensed a simmering tension, a feeling that Karen was merely regrouping, plotting her next move. Her suspicions were confirmed when she received an official-looking letter in her mailbox from the HOA. The moment Sarah saw the familiar logo on the envelope, a wave of weary frustration washed over her. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the formal language, her frustration mounting with each carefully worded sentence. The HOA was now accusing her of creating a neighborhood disturbance and deliberately making shared community resources unusable. They were actually trying to fine her for what she had done to her own private pool. Sarah let out a humorless laugh, the absurdity of the situation almost comical if it weren't so infuriating. So, this was Karen's next tactic. Unable to intimidate Sarah directly, she had decided to weaponize the very organization that had enabled her outrageous behavior in the first place. But Sarah wasn't about to let Karen win this round either. Instead of ignoring the notice or getting into another fruitless argument with the HOA, Sarah took the letter straight to her lawyer, the same one who had helped her draft the cease and desist letter. He barely glanced at the official document before shaking his head with a wry smile. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said confidently. "This is an obvious abuse of power." That was exactly what Sarah needed to hear. Armed with her lawyer's reassurance, she sent an official response back to the HOA, making it crystal clear that any further attempts to fine her or interfere with her private property would result in immediate legal action. She made sure to copy the entire HOA board on the email, ensuring that they understood she was not backing down. Less than 24 hours later, Sarah received a new email from the HOA president. The proposed fine had been reconsidered and was no longer applicable. Sarah knew that this small victory wasn't the end of it. Karen wasn't just after her pool. This was about control, about maintaining her perceived dominance in the neighborhood. She had spent so long getting her way that the mere idea of someone daring to stand up to her was likely unbearable, and Sarah knew she wouldn't simply let it go. Sure enough, the very next morning, as Sarah watered her flower beds, she saw Karen lurking outside her house, standing on the sidewalk with a determined, almost menacing look on her face. This time, however, she wasn't alone. Flanking her on either side were two members of the HOA board, dressed in their usual attire that screamed fake professionalism: the short woman with the oversized clipboard and the tall, thin man who always looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. Sarah, refusing to be intimidated, stepped out onto her porch before they even had a chance to knock, crossing her arms as she looked at the three of them, a silent challenge in her gaze. Karen gave her a tight-lipped, insincere smile. "We need to have a discussion," she stated, her voice brittle. Sarah tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "About what?" The short woman with the clipboard cleared her throat, her eyes scanning Sarah as if she were a particularly problematic specimen under a microscope. "There have been multiple complaints about your behavior towards other community members," she recited, her tone practiced and robotic, as if reading from a script. Sarah raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh? And who exactly has been complaining?" Karen quickly jumped in, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "You've been harassing neighbors, creating unnecessary drama, and refusing to cooperate with the HOA's decisions." Sarah almost laughed at the sheer hypocrisy of Karen's statement. "You mean the same HOA that tried to claim my private pool as public property?" The other board member, the tall, thin man who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Eisenhower administration, gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. "We are here to find a solution that works for everyone," he intoned, his voice as dry as dust. Sarah leaned against her doorframe, staring at them for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. "Here's my solution," she said, her voice firm and leaving no room for argument. "Karen stays off my property. End of discussion." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms with a defiant huff. "That's not going to work." Sarah smirked, a hint of triumph flickering in her eyes. "Then I guess we don't have anything to talk about." The clipboard woman shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Sarah and Karen. "We'd rather not escalate this into something more serious," she said, her voice losing some of its practiced authority. Sarah let out a short, incredulous chuckle. "More serious than trespassing, unauthorized business operations, and HOA corruption?" Karen's face twisted with barely contained fury, her eyes blazing with resentment. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "This isn't over. You might have won this little battle, but I promise you, I'll get the last word." Sarah sighed, a weary sound that conveyed her utter lack of concern. "Karen, you already lost. You just haven't accepted it yet." Karen glared at her for a few more tense seconds, her nostrils flaring with anger, before finally turning on her heel and storming off down the sidewalk, her two HOA lackeys hesitating for a moment before awkwardly following her. Sarah watched them go, shaking her head in disbelief at their continued support of Karen's outrageous behavior. Later that evening, Sarah checked her security footage again, just to make sure everything was still in place. The cameras had captured the entire ridiculous interaction on her porch, just like they had captured every other ridiculous stunt Karen had pulled. Sarah saved the file, knowing that it might come in handy later, a digital record of Karen's escalating absurdity. Sarah had expected Karen to try something new, some fresh wave of petty harassment. But she wasn't prepared for just how desperate and frankly, unhinged, Karen was willing to get. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of loud, aggressive banging on her front door, the insistent pounding echoing through her quiet house. When she cautiously opened it, she found two uniformed police officers standing on her porch, their expression serious and official. "Good morning," one of them said, his gaze direct. "Are you the homeowner?" Sarah nodded, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "Yeah." "What's going on?" The other officer glanced down at his notepad. "We received a report of public endangerment involving a body of water on your property." It took Sarah all of half a second to realize what was happening. Karen had actually called the cops on her. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples in weary exasperation. "Let me guess, my pool?" The officer nodded. "We have a report stating that you've made it hazardous and that it's posing a risk to children in the neighborhood." Sarah almost laughed, the sheer audacity of Karen's latest move bordering on the surreal. This was Karen's master plan? Calling the police because Sarah had made her own private pool too cold for Karen's illegal swim lessons? "Feel free to take a look," Sarah said, stepping aside and gesturing towards her backyard. The officers walked past her and into the backyard, their expressions shifting from professional seriousness to mild bewilderment as they took in the scene. The pool, still partially covered in a layer of melting ice, sat undisturbed, exactly as Sarah had left it. One officer knelt down and examined the water, dipping his hand in and then quickly pulling it out with a slight grimace. "This is just ice," he stated, looking back at Sarah with a questioning gaze. Sarah nodded calmly. "That's right. I never invited anyone to use my pool. Karen and her so-called swim class were trespassing. She didn't like that I stopped her, so now she's making up complaints." The officers exchanged knowing glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was clear they thought the whole situation was utterly ridiculous. "Well," one of them finally said, a hint of amusement in his voice, "as far as we're concerned, you haven't broken any laws. Your pool is on private property, and you can do whatever you want with it." Sarah smiled, a genuine smile of relief and vindication. "Would you mind writing up a report saying that? Just in case she tries anything else." The officer nodded. "Absolutely." As the officers were leaving, Sarah noticed Karen standing across the street, her arms crossed, watching the entire exchange with a look of thunderous fury on her face. The second Karen realized Sarah was looking at her, she turned abruptly and stalked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. That was the moment Sarah knew she had truly won. Karen had pulled every trick she could think of, manipulating the HOA, gathering fake complaints, even resorting to calling the police, and none of it had worked. She was finally out of options. That evening, Sarah sat outside on her patio, a cool glass of lemonade in her hand, watching the sunset cast a warm glow over the now peaceful, ice-free water of her pool. No uninvited guests, no entitled demands, just Sarah and her property, exactly as it should have been all along. Karen had lost, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt completely and utterly victorious. The next morning, Sarah woke up expecting some sort of retaliatory strike from Karen, a final, desperate attempt to reignite their conflict. But the neighborhood was strangely quiet. No kids screaming in her backyard, no entitled voice barking demands at her front door, and no ridiculous HOA letters trying to fine her for simply existing. It was almost unsettling, this sudden, unexpected peace. After everything Karen had pulled, Sarah couldn't quite believe she had actually given up. But she knew better than to let her guard down completely. Karen wasn't the type to go down without trying to take everyone else with her. Deciding to err on the side of caution, Sarah took a leisurely walk around the neighborhood, just to see if anyone had heard or seen anything. It didn't take long before she ran into one of her neighbors, Gladys, an older woman who had lived in the community longer than most. Gladys had always been friendly but tended to stay out of the neighborhood drama. This time, however, she had a knowing smirk on her face the moment she saw Sarah. "I heard Karen's little stunt with the cops didn't work out the way she planned," Gladys said, shaking her head in amusement. "She was absolutely furious when she got back home." Sarah chuckled, a genuine laugh of relief. "Yeah, she really thought she could get me in trouble for putting ice in my own pool." Gladys let out a hearty snort. "Well, it looks like that was the final straw for a lot of people. Word is, she's been ranting to anyone who will listen about how unfairly she's been treated. She even went to the HOA board demanding that they do something, but after everything that's happened, no one wants to be associated with her anymore." That caught Sarah's interest. "What do you mean?" Gladys's smirk widened. "Well, apparently, some of your neighbors didn't exactly appreciate being lied to about your pool being a community resource. Once they saw that video you posted, they started questioning other decisions the HOA has made. You're not the only one who's had problems with them, you know." Sarah hadn't considered that before, but it made perfect sense. Karen wasn't the only entitled individual in the HOA, and if she had been getting away with bending the rules for so long, it was likely that others had been doing the same. Now that Sarah had shone a spotlight on their questionable practices, the HOA couldn't simply sweep it all under the rug anymore. Later that day, Sarah received another email from the HOA president. At first, a familiar wave of apprehension washed over her, expecting another pathetic attempt to intimidate her. But when she opened the message, she was pleasantly surprised. The email was short and surprisingly formal, stating that after a thorough review of recent events, the board had made the decision to remove Karen from any position of influence within the HOA. While she would remain a resident, she no longer held any authority, and any further complaints from her would be treated as personal disputes rather than community matters. Sarah couldn't stop the wide grin that spread across her face. It was exactly what she had been hoping for. Without the full backing of the HOA, Karen's power had been effectively neutered. She was just another neighbor now, and if she tried to pull any more of her entitled stunts, she would have to deal with Sarah directly. Something told Sarah that Karen wasn't going to risk that again. A few days passed, and the neighborhood seemed to settle into a new, more peaceful rhythm. No more surprise HOA visits, no more entitled parents thinking they had a right to her property. Sarah finally got to enjoy her own backyard without constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next ridiculous intrusion. But then, something unexpected happened. One evening, as Sarah was sitting outside, sipping a glass of iced tea and watching the water in her pool ripple under the soft, fading sunlight, she heard a familiar, unwelcome voice. "Enjoying yourself?" Sarah turned her head, her heart sinking slightly as she saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, her arms crossed, an expression of pure bitterness etched onto her face. Karen looked tired, her usual polished appearance slightly disheveled, as if she hadn't been sleeping well. And for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun, the smug, self-assured confidence that usually radiated from her was noticeably absent. Sarah leaned back in her chair, keeping her tone casual. "Yep. It's nice to finally get some peace and quiet." Karen scoffed, a short, dismissive sound. "You think you won, don't you?" Sarah shrugged, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I don't think I know." Karen's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white. But she didn't say anything for a long moment. Instead, she let out a deep, shaky breath and slowly shook her head, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I hope you're happy," she finally said, her voice low and filled with resentment. "You ruined everything for me." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression one of genuine curiosity. "You mean I ruined your little business that was illegally using my private property?" She paused for a beat. "Yeah, Karen. I guess I'm pretty happy about that." Karen glared at her, her eyes flashing with anger. "You just had to be difficult, didn't you? You couldn't just let it go." Sarah let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Karen, you broke into my backyard, ignored multiple warnings, used my pool without my permission, made money off of it, and then tried to get the HOA and the police to intimidate me. What exactly was I supposed to just let go?" Karen didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over at the pool, her gaze almost wistful, as if she were finally realizing, with a pang of regret, that she was never going to have control over it again. Then, with a final, frustrated huff, she turned around and walked away down the sidewalk, disappearing around the corner without another word. Sarah watched her go, shaking her head in weary resignation. Even now, after everything, Karen still seemed to view herself as the victim. But at least now, she no longer had the power to make Sarah's life miserable. A week later, Sarah heard the news from Gladys. Karen had put her house up for sale. Whether it was out of sheer embarrassment, lingering frustration, or a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of her actions, she was leaving the neighborhood. Sarah wasn't sure if she had been pressured out by the HOA's newfound scrutiny or if she simply couldn't bear to live in a community where she no longer held sway, but either way, Sarah wasn't complaining. The day Karen's moving trucks arrived, Sarah sat on her porch with a cold drink in hand, watching as the movers hauled away the last vestiges of Karen's entitled existence. Karen didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't even glance in Sarah's direction as she climbed into the passenger seat of the moving van. By the time the last truck rumbled down the street and out of sight, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, complete and total peace. That night, some of the neighbors, emboldened by Karen's departure and the HOA's recent reforms, decided to throw an impromptu neighborhood gathering, almost as if celebrating the end of an era. Sarah, usually one to shy away from social events, made an exception this time. People shared stories about their own frustrating run-ins with Karen and the HOA, laughing over the sheer absurdity of some of the rules and Karen's unwavering belief in her own superiority. It was clear that Sarah hadn't been the only one dealing with her nonsense. At one point during the evening, one of the neighbors jokingly suggested that Sarah should fill her pool with ice again, just for old time's sake. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "Nah," she said, a mischievous glint in her eye, "but I kept the receipt. Just in case anyone else tries to pull the same stunt." The night ended with everyone in good spirits, a sense of community and shared relief hanging in the air. As Sarah walked back to her quiet house, she took one last look at her backyard. The pool shimmered under the soft moonlight, completely and utterly hers. No entitled neighbors, no HOA harassment, no unwanted swim lessons, just the peaceful tranquility she had longed for. As she closed the door behind her, a profound sense of satisfaction washed over her. This whole ordeal, as infuriating and stressful as it had been, had actually worked out in her favor. Not only had she gotten rid of Karen, but she had also exposed the HOA's corruption, gained the respect and camaraderie of her neighbors, and most importantly, reclaimed her own home and her own peace of mind. In the end, Sarah hadn't just won a battle. She had made it abundantly clear that no one would ever dare to mess with her again. And that, she realized, was the most satisfying victory of all. Valuable lesson for the audience: stand your ground when your rights are being violated, even against seemingly powerful or entitled individuals. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to get creative and garner community support when dealing with unreasonable neighbors or corrupt organizations. Sometimes, a little bit of strategic thinking and a healthy dose of audacity can go a long way in reclaiming your peace and property. What do you think of Sarah's icy revenge? Have you ever dealt with a difficult neighbor or a problematic HOA? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more engaging content.